How many lands should you run in your cEDH deck? This is a hotly debated topic with answers ranging from modest to extreme ends of the spectrum. It's a question that you get a very nuanced and passionate argument for every answer possible. Something that I think people get wrong, however, is that there isn't a single correct answer to this question. I would argue that for all of the different answers that you could receive from players, there are reasonable arguments for just about every number to choose between 23 and 33. cEDH is a meta full of homogeneous deck lists, and I think that leads people to believe that decks should be more similar than they are different. But in the same way that not every Grixis deck runs the same interaction suite and not every Tymna deck runs the same amount of creatures, I think the correct number of lands to run in your cEDH deck can be determined by asking a few core questions about how our deck works and how we plan to pilot it. What turn do we plan to win? How do we make our mana? What spells are we trying to cast? And how do we see more cards? One of the first factors to consider is speed. By that I mean how quickly does your deck plan to win? One of the most basic rules of Magic is that we can only play one land per turn. While there are decks in the meta that run exploration effects, they are very few and far between. So the question we have to ask is, what turn do we want to win the game on? In a Turbo Ad Nauseam deck that wants to end the game on turn 2, we're building the deck towards a game plan that can only possibly have 3 lands at maximum on the board in the case of having a Gemstone Caverns. Otherwise, only 2. Not only do these aggressive decks not need these extra land drops, they actively don't want them. When we think about how a turbo deck makes mana, the first thing that we think of are ritual effects and free mana rocks. Lands are locked to 1 per turn, but the turbo deck's main strategy is to skirt around this rule by making a lot of mana with spells in our hand rather than our resources on the battlefield. Obviously, spending these cards from our hand to make mana for payoffs isn't free. It costs us spending those cards and getting blown out by the first opponent to have a Mindbreak trap. That's why turbo decks aren't racing to try to resolve all their win cons in the early game, they're trying to resolve their advantage engines like Wheel of Fortune or Ad Nauseam. The Turbo deck's hand of 7 cards won't be able to resolve Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation through opponent's 21 cards in most scenarios. Instead, the Turbo deck is trying to establish advantage over the table by casting mana rocks that they can transition into advantage spells. Turbo decks are operating under the premise that they can make more mana and spend more cards from their hand on turn 1 than the average Midrange or Stax deck, and by leveraging our game plan around these massive advantage spells, we don't have the pressure for our top decks to contain lands. We don't want to try to draw 1 card on turn 2, we want to draw 8 cards with our Wheel of Fortune or 30 with our Ad Nauseam. If we mulligan aggressively to a hand with 1 land that can cast most of the spells in it and draw 7 on the next turn, we have a much higher probability of finding the second land that we need to win the game. For decks like Ikra Rograk's Citadel that want to win as early as turn 1, having as few as 23 lands actively supports that game plan. More of the deck is devoted to casting mana-positive ritual spells and turning it into advantage spells than the average Midrange or Stax deck. It's specifically what the archetype is trying to accomplish. Likewise, decks that are well equipped to draw a lot of cards like Tymna and Crom can afford to run a fewer number of lands because of its density of cards that make mana quickly and the abundance of ways to refuel its hand. It's a deck that has not only the options for turbo refueling and wheels and Ad Nauseam and access to the suite of Study Buddies and Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, and Esper Sentinel, it also gives card advantage in your command zone to draw anywhere from an extra 1 at minimum to an extra 15 at maximum cards per turn cycle. Tymna Crom is a deck that shines because it easily pivots between these turbo strategies to a mid-range game plan, and the huge list of card advantage engines is the reason why it can make those land drops and get away with running as few as 27 or 28 lands. We don't ensure the statistical probability that our land drops come on time because of the sheer amount of them in our deck, we ensure it by the number of cards that we see during the time that the game lasts. But if we think about more mid-range decks like Tymna Thrasios or Tivit for instance, those same motivations for card slots don't directly translate. Comedian's list for Tivit, similarly to Turbo decks, runs Time Twister, Windfall, Dark Ritual, and all of the mana-positive rocks, and it also runs 30 lands. This list has the capability to make explosive early plays, but it is not the motivation for those slots. The deck has a 6-mana commander, it has combos that can be spread as far as across 3 pieces and 7 mana. This is a deck that does not want to play aggressively in the early game. It's a deck that wants to play aggressively when it's ready to. This is the kind of deck that wants to bring a game to turn 4 or more while it lands control pieces and combo pieces like Displacer Kitten, Urza, or Toxic Deluge, or setting up advantage engines like Smothering Tithe or its commander. This is a deck that has explosive mana to keep up with the speed of the format as well as powering out our high CMC spells, but it doesn't contain every ritual that it could like Rain of Filth or Cabal Ritual because it can't afford to devote those slots to mana. This is a deck that wants to control the board with mana that can't be denied by a counterspell. Tivit is the kind of deck that wants to make all of its land drops and ensure that it can control the board, and then sculpt its hand with pieces of incremental card advantage like Rhystic Study, Archivist of Ogma, or clues from Tivit. This combination of the ability to draw somewhere between 2 and 4 cards per turn cycle with our various advantage engines, and the literal number of lands in our deck, help to keep the statistical probability high that we continuously hit our land drops over the course of the game. On the very extreme end of the spectrum, hard Stax decks like Winota run as many as 32 or 33 lands, including MDFCs, because of the philosophy of their deck construction. In a deck that tries to limit things like the amount of cards that a player can draw per turn, or the amount of spells that a player can cast per turn, there's absolutely no room to run ritual spells outside of the most basic mana-positive rocks. Ideally, a deck like Winota doesn't have to spend much mana if it can resolve a Jeweled Lotus into Winota and swing with free creatures like Ornithopter to start landing big creatures for free on turn 2. But Winota is a deck with only one combo. It's a deck that wants to win the game over multiple combat steps and multiple turns. It has cards that it might have to cast that cost as much as 5 mana, and it wants to do that without access to cards like Dark Ritual or even Rite of Flame. It's a deck designed not to let players see more than one card per turn. That means we have a much higher priority on our draw step, giving us exactly what we need to enact our game plan. Winota is a Stax deck that sees a lot of cards while it plays, but the amount of cards that it can put into its hand is extremely limited. The cards that Winota plays that allows us to see extra cards to put into play as the land only go as far as Esper Sentinel, Archivist of Augment, Professional Facebreaker. Likewise, the ramp package is very impactful but extremely concise, with things like Ornithopter, Paradise, Goldmere, and Goldhound as some of the few sources that we have for playing more than one mana producing permanent per turn. The difference in statistical probability of having 2 lands in your opening hand with 28 lands in your deck versus 30 lands is easy to calculate, and it's extremely minuscule. To that end, there's no mathematic difference to running 28 versus 30 lands in your deck, and the same is mostly true of running 26 lands versus 30 lands. But the lands in your opening hand aren't the entire story of every game for every deck. Turbo decks have the incentive, the means, and the ability to run 26 lands or even infuse 23 lands, as long as their deck is designed to correctly take advantage of that. Hard Stax decks don't have those same capabilities and have completely different game plans with completely different card choices and motivating factors for them. The number of lands you should run in your deck is often talked about as if there's one specific number that could be objectively correct for every deck, but that's not true of any format that exists in Magic, and certainly not one with as much variance as cEDH. The number of lands you should run in your deck is nuanced and affected by everything from the colors in your deck to the commanders you're running and your individual card choices. Finding that sweet spot between the typical 27 and 30 lands in most lists is less about what you do with those 3 card slots, and more about how your deck answers those 4 questions. When do we want to win? How do we make our mana? What spells are we trying to cast? And how do we see more cards?